The bell rope descended 400 feet into darkness that had no business existing beneath a church tower that stood only 120 feet tall. Thomas Wells discovered this impossibility on the cold morning of March 17, 1879. He arrived, as he had every Sunday for 14 years, to ring the bells for the 10 o'clock service. The St. Michael's Church of Asherton, Pennsylvania, was his charge, his inheritance. The position of bell ringer had passed to him from his father, and from his father's father before him. It was a duty measured not in hours, but in repetitions, in the familiar weight of the bronze and the precise length of the hemp. He knew, with a certainty bordering on the sacred, exactly how much rope was required. He knew the pull: 3 short tugs for faith, 2 long for hope, and a final, steady pull for charity. He knew the resistance of the mechanisms, the groan of the oiled wheels, the exact moment the clapper would strike bronze, sending the call to worship echoing across the valley. On this morning, none of that happened. He entered the small, dust-filled ringing chamber at the tower's base, the air still carrying the frigid bite of the pre-dawn fog. He nodded to the empty room, a habit he'd formed in solitude, and grasped the thick, familiar rope. He pulled, and he kept pulling. The first tug met no resistance. There was no satisfying counterweight, no sign of the great bell engaging far above. The rope simply unspooled from the aperture in the ceiling, descending into his hands as if it were being fed to him from an infinite spool. He frowned, bracing his boots on the worn floorboards, and pulled again, hand over hand, using his back and legs. The rope came down, and down, and down. A minute passed. His hands, calloused and tough, began to sting. This was not the dry, dusty hemp he had held last Sunday. This new length of rope, emerging from the darkness above, was damp. It was cold, with a subterranean chill that felt nothing like the surface air. It was slick with something he couldn't identify, a thin, mineral-smelling film. 2 minutes. His arms began to burn. The pile of rope coiling at his feet was already higher than his knees. The smell in the small chamber was changing. The familiar scent of dry rot and bat guano was being overpowered by something else, something primal. It was the smell of freshly turned earth, of deep, wet clay, and something else beneath it, something older than earth, a scent like oxidized metal and forgotten cellars. 5 minutes. Thomas was gasping now, his Sunday shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold. He was no longer pulling, he was merely gathering. The rope descended under its own impossible weight, spilling into the room. He looked at the coiled mass at his feet. It was darker now. The fibers stained a deep, greenish black, as if they had been steeped in stagnant water for a century. He saw fine, pale rootlets, like tiny white nerves, tangled in the weave. He wanted to stop. He wanted to run out into the weak March sunlight and tell Reverend Thornton that the bells were broken. But he couldn't. His hands, raw and aching, continued their task, hand over hand, gathering the impossible length, driven by a horrified mechanical compulsion. He had to see the end. He had to know what was at the bottom of this. 10 minutes. His muscles screamed. The pile of hemp in the room was monstrous, filling the chamber from wall to wall, climbing his legs. The smell was overpowering, a thick, fungal miasma of decay and depth. And then, finally, his hands closed on the end. It wasn't frayed or cut. It was a perfectly finished knot, complex and unfamiliar. A series of loops and braids that no sailor or rigger in Asherton would have recognized. It was cold and heavy, like a stone. Thomas Wells stood panting in the center of the small room, buried to his waist in 400 feet of rope that had somehow emerged from a tower only 120 feet tall. The church was silent. The bells above him had never moved. He stared at his raw, red hands, at the black slime that covered them. He looked at the aperture in the ceiling, a simple 4-inch hole through which the rope had always passed, connecting the ringing chamber to the bells above. It was just a hole. It obeyed the laws of architecture. A single pale worm, no thicker than a thread, wriggled from the knot in his hand. And then the bells began to ring. The sound did not come from above. It came from below. A single bass tone, so deep it was felt more than heard. Boom! The vibration traveled up through the stone foundation of the church, through the wooden floorboards, through the soles of Thomas's boots. It resonated in his chest, in his jaw, in the fillings of his teeth. This was not the bright, clear call of faith, hope, and charity. This was deeper, older, heavier. The sound of metal that had hung in absolute darkness for millennia, striking a note that seemed to come from the bottom of a mine shaft or the end of a flooded tunnel. Bah! Dust sifted from the rafters. A small crack appeared in the plaster wall. Thomas fell back against the wall, dropping the knot, his heart hammering in terrified synchronization with the impossible bell. Boom! Outside, the congregation, gathering on the patchy grass for the Sunday service, heard and felt it. They stopped, conversations dying mid-sentence. Mothers pulled their children close. The men, farmers whose families had worked the rich valley soil for 3 generations, and miners whose livelihoods came from the coal seams that ran like dark veins beneath that soil, looked up at the bell tower. The bells were motionless, yet the sound continued, vibrating through the very earth they stood on. Boom! Every person present, all 237 souls who called Asherton home, felt the same, simultaneous, irrational urge. It was a sudden, visceral hunger in their muscles and hands. They wanted to dig. They wanted to put their hands in the dirt and tear it away. Reverend Isaiah Thornton, his black robes flapping, was the first to reach the tower. He was a man of logic and scripture, a man who believed the world was ordered by God's unwavering mathematics. He burst into the ringing room and stopped dead. He saw Thomas Wells, pale as death, sitting on the floor. He saw the room, impossibly filled with the dark, stinking rope. And he felt the final, deep toll vibrate up through his own bones. A sound of such profound and ancient resonance that it shook the very foundations of his faith. The ringing ceased. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the sound itself. Thomas Wells looked up at his minister, his eyes wide and vacant. He spoke the words that would mark the beginning of Asherton's descent into something no theology could explain. "The rope goes down, Reverend," Thomas whispered, his voice hollow. "It doesn't go up. It goes down. The bells, the real bells, are below us. We've just never pulled long enough to reach them before." What lay beneath St. Michael's Church was a question that reason and faith were equally unequipped to answer. The attempts to apply rational means would be the first casualty of the days to come. Reverend Thornton, in a state of clinical shock, sealed the ringing room and canceled the service, offering the bewildered congregation a stammering excuse about structural instability. But the secret was already out. The sound had been heard, the vibration had been felt, and the rope was real. That afternoon, Thornton summoned the town's most pragmatic minds to the parsonage. Dr. William Cartwright, the town physician and a man of empirical science, and Ambrose Thorne, the owner of the Asherton Colliery, a man who believed in nothing but geology and profit margins. "A sinkhole," Thorne declared, pacing the Reverend's study, his heavy boots scuffing the floor. "It's obvious. The church was built on unstable ground. The foundation has cracked. The rope fell through into a cavern. What Wells pulled up was his own rope, covered in mud from a cave. 400 feet of it?" Dr. Cartwright countered, adjusting his spectacles. He was a younger man, precise and skeptical. "From a 120-foot tower? The mathematics are unsound, Ambrose. And that doesn't explain the sound. A bell of immense size. Echoes," Thorne snapped, though his certainty was fraying. "Sound plays tricks underground. It's gas. A pocket of methane igniting, perhaps." "It was a bell," Thornton said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the church records spread across his desk. "It struck 15 times, at a perfect, measured interval." "Then it's a prank," Thorne insisted. "Someone is digging under your church, Reverend, trying to scare us. Or perhaps looking for coal." "I don't think so," Thornton murmured, his finger tracing a line in the church's original construction ledger, dated 1851. He had read this ledger 100 times, but today the words seemed different, sinister. "My predecessor, Reverend Blackwood, noted difficulties with the foundation. The benefactor, Josiah Asherton, insisted on this specific site." He read the entry aloud. "October 14th, 1851. The excavation crew refuses to dig deeper than 8 feet. They complain the ground feels wrong and sounds hollow. One man, a Mr. Brody, claims his shovel struck something that rang like cold iron. He has since fled the county. Mr. Asherton was most displeased and has brought in his own men from Philadelphia to finish the work." Cartwright leaned in. "Is there more?" Thornton turned the page to a financial log. A single massive expenditure. To J. Asherton, for geological accommodation and foundation sealing. The sum is extraordinary. Enough to have built the church twice over. He was hiding something, Cartwright said. A mineral deposit, a private mine, or sealing something, Thornton replied. He found a personal letter from Josiah Asherton tucked into the back of the ledger. He unfolded the brittle paper. The handwriting was sharp, precise. My dear Reverend Blackwood, he read, you have chosen a fine name in St. Michael, the protector, the warrior who cast the dragon into the pit. It is fitting. Let the church stand as his spear, pinning the beast. Let the bells you hang above ring out, so that their bright song may deafen the ears of the congregation to any echoes that may rise from below. The ground accepts what is built upon it, but the deep places remember what was promised them. A cold silence filled the study. Ambrose Thorne's face had lost its ruddy color. This is superstitious nonsense, Thorne said, but his voice lacked conviction. Promises, dragons, this is the rambling of a religious fanatic. Josiah Asherton was not a fanatic, Cartwright said quietly. He was a brilliant engineer. He designed the sluices and the steam donkeys for the first mines. He understood geology better than any man in Pennsylvania. If he spent that sum sealing a foundation, it was for a physical reason. The decision was made. They would investigate. Not by digging, not yet, but by examining the evidence. They unsealed the ringing room. Thorne, Cartwright, and Thornton, joined by a reluctant Thomas Wells, entered. The room was just as Wells had left it. The monstrous pile of dark, reeking rope dominated the space. It had not dried. If anything, it seemed wetter, and the fungal smell was stronger. Cartwright, ever the man of science, put on thick leather gloves and began to fabric inspect the rope. He pulled a length of it into the light of his lantern. The fibers, he murmured. This isn't hemp. Or if it is, it's been altered, petrified. No, permeated. It's saturated with iron, copper, and something organic I cannot identify. The rootlets they're growing, gentlemen. Look. He held the lantern close. The tiny, pale white tendrils were visibly, slowly, coiling and uncoiling in the light. Ambrose Thorne swore, stumbling back into the hallway. Burn it all. No, Cartwright said, his scientific curiosity overpowering his revulsion. He took a knife and tried to cut a sample. The blade scraped against the fibers with a metallic sound, barely leaving a mark. It's as hard as iron wire. Thomas, you pulled 400 feet of this up? With your bare hands? Thomas Wells just stared at his bandaged hands, his face a mask of trauma. It wasn't that hard, he whispered. Not until the end. It wanted to come up. Reverend Thornton, meanwhile, had brought a ladder. He was examining the aperture in the ceiling. It's just as it was. Wood. Plaster. The hole leads directly to the belfry. There is no space for this thing to have been coiled. It came from the belfry, as it always has. But it did not originate there. A paradox, Cartwright said, bagging a small sample of the rootlets. The rope came from above, but it originated from below. Which means, Thornton said, his voice grim, that the hole in the floor of the ringing room is not the only connection. The rope in the belfry, it doesn't just hang from the bells, it passes through them, through the tower, and into the ground. The implication was so monstrous that no one dared speak it aloud. That the St. Michael's bell tower, the town's symbol of faith and heavenward aspiration, was nothing but a conduit, a hollow tube connecting the surface world to the abyss. They tried to return the rope. 4 strong men, including Thorne, grasped the heavy wet mass and tried to feed it back up the hole. It would not move. They tied it to a draft horse. The horse strained, its muscles bunching, and the rope simply stretched. It elongated like black rubber, thin and taut, but it would not ascend. It was anchored to something with the weight of a mountain. They were forced to leave it, coiled in the ringing room like a great dark serpent. They sealed the room again, locking it, but the smell began to permeate the church. For a week, Asherton lived in a state of suspended dread. The congregation held service on the church lawn, casting fearful glances at the silent tower. The town split into factions. Thorne's faction, the rationalists, argued for bringing in engineers from Philadelphia. perhaps even dynamite, to clear the tower and fix the problem. The hysterics claimed it was a sign from God, a warning, and that the church should be abandoned. And then there was a third group, small at first, centered around Jacob Morrison, the miner who had felt the bell in his chest. They were the listeners. They didn't speak much. They simply gathered at the edge of the churchyard, closest to the tower. They would stand for hours, heads tilted, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. Ilara, his pregnant wife, would beg him to come home. "You can't hear it, can you?" Jacob would ask her, his eyes distant. "It's still there, faint, like a heart beating under the rock. It's waiting." Dr. Cartwright became obsessed. He spent his days in his small surgery, analyzing the rootlets. They were chemotrophic, he found. They didn't feed on sunlight, but on minerals. Specifically, they fed on the unique blend of iron and coal that ran beneath Asherton. He wrote in his journal, "They are not flora, they are fauna, or perhaps something that blurs the line. They function as a nervous system transmitting... what? Information? Energy? The rope is not a rope. It is an organ, a tentacle." On the next Sunday, March 24th, Reverend Thornton forbade Thomas Wells from going near the tower. He intended to lead a prayer service begging for deliverance, but Thomas Wells could not stay away, nor could Jacob Morrison and his listeners. While the town gathered on the lawn, Thomas, looking like a man in a trance, slipped the key from the Reverend's office. He unlocked the ringing room. Jacob and 4 other miners followed him inside. The room was thick with the fungal smell. The rope lay piled, dark and waiting. "Thomas, no," Jacob said, but his voice was weak. "I have to," Thomas whispered. "It's not finished. We didn't reach the end. We just reached the first end." He grasped the rope, the familiar, unfamiliar knot, and pulled. This time, there was no resistance at all. It was as if something on the other end had been waiting, and now let go. The rope descended in a rush, spilling into the room, faster and faster. The men scrambled back as the chamber filled. The rope that emerged now was different. It was thicker, covered not just in slime but in chunks of black sedimentary rock and thick, oily bitumen. The smell was of crude oil and sulfur. It unspooled for 20 minutes. When the end finally came, 800 feet of rope lay coiled in the church, spilling out into the hallway. The new knot was the size of a man's head, tied from 3 separate strands, and embedded in it was a shard of black volcanic glass, sharp as a razor. Thomas Wells stood back, his work done, and the bells rang again. It was not one bell, it was a symphony. A deep, complex, terrifying harmony of dozens, perhaps hundreds of bells, all ringing from the depths. The sound was so powerful that the ground itself visibly shook. The windows of the church shattered instantly. The congregation outside screamed, falling to their knees as the earth buckled. The sound was not just sound. It was a frequency. It resonated in their skulls, their bones. Dr. Cartwright, clutching his head, felt his vision blur, the very light waves around him seeming to bend. He saw colors that shouldn't exist, and the compulsion, the urge to dig, returned with the force of a physical blow. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a command. Reverend Thornton watched in horror as his congregation, his civilized flock, clawed at the ground, tearing at the grass and dirt with their bare, bleeding hands. Ambrose Thorne, the rationalist, was on his knees, weeping and digging alongside them, his face a mask of ecstatic terror. Inside the tower, Jacob Morrison let out a great shout of understanding. "The basement! Not here! It's the basement! The foundation!" He ran from the ringing room, grabbing a pickaxe that had been left by the wall. The other listeners followed him. They stormed into the main sanctuary, kicked open the door to the cellar stairs, and descended into the dark. The bell song continued, a maddening, complex rhythm that seemed to be rearranging their very thoughts. Reverend Thornton and Dr. Cartwright, the only two seemingly resisting the worst of the psychic assault, followed them down. Ilara Morrison was right behind them, screaming for her husband. The cellar was 8 feet high, the floor hard-packed earth, the walls the original 1851 stone foundation. The air was thick with the vibration. Jacob Morrison stood in the center of the room, his head tilted, the bell song vibrating around him. "Here," he whispered. He raised the pickaxe. "Jacob, stop!" Ilara cried. "This is madness! Think of the baby!" "I am," Jacob said, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, newfound purpose. "It's not for us. It's for him. He needs to hear it too." He struck the ground. The sound was not the thud of dirt. It was the bong of struck metal. The same sound the first workman had heard, but 1,000 times louder. The earth itself rang like a struck bell, its tone in perfect harmony with the cacophony from below. A network of cracks radiated from the point of impact, and from them, a faint, cold, blue light began to glow. The digging had begun. The men worked in a frenzy that was both terrifying and unnervingly efficient. There was no discussion, no plan. The miners simply fell into the rhythm of their trade, but amplified by the bell's hypnotic pulse. Pickaxes rose and fell in perfect, terrible synchrony. Shovels cleared the earth, passing it back to a human chain that included farmers, the town clerk, and even old Mrs. Gable, who hadn't moved faster than a shuffle in a decade. They worked with supernatural strength and stamina, their movements economical and precise, as if choreographed by the resonant frequencies that filled the air. Dr. Cartwright watched, his mind reeling, trying to document what he was seeing. He grabbed his medical bag, checking the pupils of one of the diggers, a young farmer named Silas. The man's eyes were fully dilated, unreactive to the lantern light, yet he moved with perfect coordination, his face serene, almost blissful. "It's the sound!" Cartwright yelled to Thornton over the din of the bells and the digging. "A resonant frequency. It's bypassed their cognitive function. It's tapping directly into the motor cortex. It's a form of mass hypnosis." Reverend Thornton gripped the stone wall, his knuckles white. His own hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the suppressed urge to grab a shovel and join them. The hymn of the deep bells felt like an answer. An answer to prayers he hadn't even known he was making. It promised order. It promised purpose. He fought it, clutching the small silver cross around his neck so tightly it drew blood. "This is not God's work, William. This is the other place. The pit." "It's geology, Isaiah," Cartwright shouted back, though his voice wavered. "Anomalous acoustics. We have to stop them. The foundation will collapse. The whole church will come down." He tried to grab Jacob Morrison's shoulder. "Jacob, stop! You're endangering everyone." Jacob turned, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. He wasn't panting. None of them were. Their breathing seemed to have slowed, synchronized with the gaps between the bell tolls. He looked at the doctor with eyes that were calm and ancient. "It won't collapse," Jacob said, his voice a low monotone. "It was built to be opened. The walls are stable." He knew. Asherton knew. He turned back to his work, swinging the pickaxe. It struck the ground, and this time it broke through. A collective gasp, a simultaneous inhalation from every digger, hissed through the cellar. The pickaxe had punched through the hard-packed earth into empty space. A rush of cold, pressurized air blasted from the hole, extinguishing half the lanterns and carrying a smell so ancient it defied description. It was the smell of ozone, of dry, sterile dust, and something else. A faint metallic tang, like old blood. The bells stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was a physical blow. It was more deafening, more terrifying than the noise. In that silence, the diggers all froze, their tools held aloft. They stood like statues in the flickering gloom. What have we done?" Ambrose Thorne, the mine owner, whispered from the stairs. He had been helping, his expensive suit now ruined, his hands bloody. The spell, it seemed, was broken. The men looked at their hands, at the hole, at each other, as if waking from a dream. Alara Morrison rushed forward. "Jacob! Oh God, Jacob!" Jacob Morrison blinked, shaking his head as if clearing water from his ears. He looked at the hole, then at his wife. "Alara, I don't—" From the hole came a new sound. Not bells, not a vibration. It was a soft, wet, rhythmic slithering, like something immense shifting its weight in the darkness below. A young miner at the edge of the hole screamed, dropping his shovel and scrambling back. "It's moving! Something's moving down there!" Panic erupted. The diggers, moments before a synchronized machine, dissolved into a terrified mob, clawing their way toward the single cellar staircase, pushing Reverend Thornton and Ambrose Thorne aside. They spilled out into the sanctuary, into the night, screaming about the devil, about the pit, about the thing in the dark. Within a minute, the cellar was empty, save for 4 people. Reverend Thornton, leaning against the foundation wall, his face pale. Dr. Cartwright, who, despite his terror, was kneeling at the edge of the hole, his scientific curiosity a heavier anchor than his fear. Elira, who was holding on to her husband, and Jacob Morrison, who had not run. Jacob stared into the black, 3-foot-wide opening in the earth. The slithering sound had stopped. Now, there was only silence. "Jacob, come away," Elira pleaded, tugging his arm. "Please, it's over. Let's go home." "It's not over," Jacob said. He knelt beside Cartwright, his gaze locked on the darkness. He held his lantern over the aperture. The light did not penetrate. It was absorbed, eaten by the oppressive blackness. The cold air rising from it made the lantern flame gutter and turn blue. "What is it?" Thornton whispered from the wall. "A shaft," Cartwright murmured, his voice trembling. He tossed a small stone into the hole. They waited, 1 second, 2, 5, 10. There was no sound of it hitting bottom. "God preserve us," Thornton breathed. "It's not natural," Jacob said. His voice was his own again, but tinged with a new dark awe. "I've been in 100 mines. This isn't a cave. It isn't a fissure. Look at the edges." Cartwright and Thornton moved closer. The edges of the hole, where the pickaxe had broken through, were not jagged earth and rock. It was a smooth, finished surface, a dark, purplish stone, almost like obsidian, that had been polished to a near-mirror finish. The hard-packed earth and clay had been nothing but a thin cap, a plug, hiding this structure. "It's a tunnel," Cartwright said. "An artificial shaft. The walls, they feel slick." He touched the surface, then quickly withdrew his hand as if burned. "It's freezing, and it's vibrating. Very faintly." Jacob looked at his wife. "Elira, go home. Lock the doors. Take the rifle from the mantel. Don't let anyone in, not even me. Not unless I call your name 3 times. "Jacob, no. Go," he commanded, his voice a miner's bark. Elira flinched. Then, seeing the terrible resolve in his eyes, she turned and fled up the stairs, sobbing. When she was gone, Jacob turned back to the hole. He looked at the other 2 men. "The bell rope. Thomas pulled it. He woke it up. We just opened the door." "We must seal it," Thornton said, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "We'll get boards, stone, concrete from Mr. Thorne's mine. We will fill this hole and consecrate the ground." "You can't seal this," Jacob said. "Don't you understand? This is what the church was for. Not to keep us out, to keep it in. And we broke the seal. The promise Josiah Asherton made." "What are you saying, man?" Cartwright asked, backing away from the hole. "That slithering sound," Jacob said, his eyes unfocused again, listening to a memory. "I've heard it before. In the deep seams, the places where the coal runs black and glassy. The old miners, my grandfather, they called it the knocker. The thing that moves in the walls. We always thought it was the mountain settling. It wasn't." He grabbed a length of rope from a hook on the wall, one used for lowering supplies. He began tying it around his waist. "Morrison, what are you doing?" Cartwright demanded. "You can't go down there. It's a pit of unknown depth. The air could be toxic." "The air is fine," Jacob said, checking the knot. "It's cold, but it's fine. I have to see. I have to know what we woke." "This is suicide," Thornton yelled. "This is a sin of pride." "Maybe," Jacob said. He handed the end of the rope to the 2 men. "Or maybe it's penance. I was the first to strike. I'll be the first to see. Hold the rope. Give me slack. If I tug 3 times, pull me up. If the rope goes slack, run." He picked up his lantern, lit it, and before either of the stunned men could protest further, he swung his legs over the edge and descended into the impossible dark. The 2 men, a doctor of science and a minister of God, were left alone in the cellar, holding a rope that disappeared into a perfectly circular, polished black hole. They held it as if it were the last thread of sanity in a world that was rapidly unraveling. They fed the rope out. 10 feet, 20 feet. The lantern light vanished almost immediately, as if snuffed out. 50 feet. "Jacob!" Thornton called out, his voice echoing weakly in the shaft. There was no reply. 80 feet. The entire length of the cellar rope was gone. It was taut, indicating Jacob was still descending. "He's deeper than the church foundation," Cartwright said, his voice a clinical, terrified whisper. "Deeper than the hill itself." "Where is he?" The rope went slack. Cartwright and Thornton froze. They looked at each other, their faces slick with sweat. He's off the rope," Cartwright stammered. "He's at the bottom." "Or it cut," Thornton said, his hands shaking. Or it took him." They waited. The silence in the cellar was absolute, broken only by their harsh breathing. 1 minute. 2. We should pull, Cartwright said. He said 3 tugs, Thornton insisted, his eyes squeezed shut in prayer. We wait for the signal. The rope, lying coiled at their feet, began to move. It didn't tug. It began to slither, unspooling itself, dropping rapidly back into the shaft. "It's pulling more rope!" Cartwright yelled, grabbing it. "It needs more!" "We have no more!" Thornton shouted. The rope pulled taut, straining, and then, from the depths, came a voice. It was Jacob's voice, but distorted, echoing and vast, as if he were yelling from the bottom of a canyon. "Lights! I see! My God, it's a city!" The voice was cut short, not by a scream, but by a sudden clang. The sound of a bell, a single, clear, welcoming toll. And then the rope went slack again, this time for good. They waited. For an hour, the 2 most educated men in Asherton stood in a cold basement, holding a useless rope, staring at a hole in the ground. They called his name until they were hoarse. There was no answer. Finally, defeated, they left. They barred the cellar door, locking it. They stumbled out of the dark church into the chaotic town. People were in the streets, some hysterical, some packing their wagons, ready to flee. Ambrose Thorne was trying to organize a posse to find the source of the gas leak. His authority shattered, his voice cracking with fear. Dr. Cartwright went straight to his surgery. He locked the door, poured a stiff brandy, and began to write, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form the letters. Subject, J. Morrison, male, 38. Descended into anomalous shaft at approx 10:45 p.m. Unknown depth. Auditory hallucination reported. A city. Single bell chime heard on his final transmission. Subject presumed. Compromised. The shaft is not geological. It is architectural. The sounds are not a side effect. They are a mechanism. They are a call. And Jacob Morrison answered. Reverend Thornton returned to the parsonage. He did not pray. He sat in his study, the church ledger open to Josiah Asherton's letter. The deep places remember what was promised them. He now understood. Asherton hadn't built a church to seal a pit. He had built a gateway. The church wasn't a lock, it was a timer. The bells, faith, hope, and charity, weren't a call to worship. They were an alarm, designed to mask the true sound from below. And Thomas Wells, by pulling a rope that should not have existed, had just informed whatever was down there that the guardians were no longer at their post. The long, quiet night of Asherton was over. The digging was just the beginning. The sun that rose on March 25th was a weak, indifferent yellow, illuminating a town paralyzed by the previous night's revelations. Asherton was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath, of a world that had seen the mask of reality slip, revealing the cold, mechanical void beneath. Doors were locked. Blinds were drawn. The only sounds were the distant rattling of a few wagons, families fleeing the valley with whatever they could carry, not even bothering to sell their land. They were the lucky ones, the ones for whom the bells had just been a noise. For the 90-odd souls who remained, the town was now a prison. They were divided into 3 fractured groups, the terrified uncalled, who hid in their homes, the 2 men who knew the truth, and the 47 who had been changed. Dr. William Cartwright did not sleep. As dawn broke, he left his surgery, his medical bag in hand. He was a man of science, and in the absence of any recognizable physics, he would cling to the only thing he knew: observation. He would document the plague. His first stop was the home of Silas, the young farmer. He found the man not in bed, nor in a state of panic. He was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the wood grain, his hands folded. The fire in the hearth was dead, the room frigid. "Silas?" Cartwright said, his voice echoing in the small house. "Silas, it's Dr. Cartwright. I'm here to check on you." The young man turned his head, a slow, mechanical movement, as if his neck were stiff. His eyes were the most terrifying part. They were not wide with fear. They were calm, clear, and profoundly empty, like blue glass. "It's quiet, Doctor," Silas whispered. His voice was flat, without inflection. They stopped. "It's too quiet. How do you feel, son? Are you in pain?" "No, sir. I feel fine. I feel resting." Cartwright put his fingers to Silas's wrist. He held the position for a full minute, his own blood running cold. He checked again. My God. The man's pulse was not a healthy 70 beats per minute. It was a slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump. At 30. A pulse barely strong enough to sustain life, more reptile than mammal. "Silas, you're freezing," Cartwright said, touching the man's forehead. The skin was cold, clammy. "I don't feel the cold, Doc." Silas's gaze drifted back to the table. His fingers began to tap, a complex, syncopated rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. "What is that, Silas? What are you tapping?" "The song," Silas murmured, his eyes half closing in something like pleasure. "I'm just keeping the time, holding the pattern, until they start again." Cartwright backed away. This was not post-hypnotic suggestion. This was physiological recalibration. The bells had not merely controlled them, they had tuned them, like instruments, to a new and alien frequency. He visited 2 more of the diggers. It was the same. A thready pulse, a death-like body temperature, and the constant rhythmic tapping, each man on the same complex beat, though they were miles apart. They were a choir waiting for their conductor. While the doctor confronted the biological, Reverend Thornton confronted the historical. He had not returned to the parsonage. He had gone to the town hall, to the county archives, convinced that Jacob was right, that Josiah Asherton had not avoided this thing, but prepared for it. He pulled the original Valley Survey maps from 1849, drafts made before Asherton had even purchased the land. He found the chief surveyor's notes, written in a spidery, frustrated hand. "Advise against settlement. Valley is geologically unsuitable. The ground is unstable, dominated by anomalous basaltic formations and vast, unmapped, and seemingly interconnected cave systems. The local tribe, what's left of them, refuse to enter the valley. They call it the place where the earth listens." Attached to this report, however, was a separate addendum, written in Josiah Asherton's own precise, arrogant script. "Surveyor is a fool. He sees instability. I see design. The caves are not empty. They are structured. The listening is not a threat. It is an opportunity. The site is perfect. Acquire all parcels immediately." Thornton sank into the chair, the brittle paper rattling in his shaking hands. It was worse than he thought. Asherton had sought this place out. He had known. The church, the town, the farms, the mines. It was all a facade. A colony planted on the shell of an egg, waiting for it to hatch. The bells, his bells, faith, hope, and charity. They were a lie. They were a cheap alarm clock set to drown out the sound of the true mechanism below. The third faction was Ambrose Thorne. The mine owner had barricaded himself in his opulent office, drinking brandy since sunrise. His rational world had been shattered. A hole in the ground was geology. A hole in the ground that rang, that sang, that swallowed men. That was something else. But Ambrose Thorne knew only one way to deal with an obstacle in the earth: brute force. If it was a hole, he would fill it. If it made noise, he would silence it. He roared for his pit boss, a hard man named Brody. "Get me 6 men," Thorne commanded, slamming his glass down. "Men who aren't superstitious fools. Get the blasting kit from the north seam. We are collapsing that cellar. We are burying that noise under 100 tons of rock." Brody paled. "Sir, the men, they won't go near the church. They say it's unholy." "Unholy?" Thorne laughed, a harsh barking sound. "It's a hole, a pit. We are a mining town. We are masters of the earth beneath us, not its slaves. You tell them they'll get triple pay. And you tell them if they don't, I'll close the mine by sundown, and this whole valley will starve. Now, go." While the town fractured, Alara Morrison sat alone in her small cabin on the valley's edge. She had done as Jacob asked. The door was barred, the rifle loaded on her lap. She was a prisoner, listening. The silence from the town was almost as terrifying as the bells had been. She sat in the nursery Jacob had been building, his half-finished cradle in the corner. She tried to pray for his return, but she couldn't. The memory of his face at the shaft, that look of pity, had extinguished all hope. He wasn't lost. He had chosen. She put a hand on her swollen belly, trying to find comfort in the new life. "It's just us now, little one," she whispered. We'll leave this valley. We'll go east." And then the baby kicked. She gasped, a moment of relief, but it kicked again, And again. It was not a random fluttering kick. It was a rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. She stared at her own abdomen in abject horror. It was the same complex, syncopated beat she had heard the miners whistling. The same rhythm Silas was tapping on his kitchen table. The call wasn't just in the earth. It was in her. It was in his blood. The child she was carrying was already listening. It was already one of them. She let out a single thin wail of despair that no one but the silent, waiting valley could hear. By noon, the confrontation was inevitable. Ambrose Thorne and his 6 grim-faced miners marched up the hill to St. Michael's. They carried pickaxes, shovels, and 3 heavy wooden crates marked Danger Explosives. Cartwright and Thornton, drawn by the commotion, ran to intercept them. "Ambrose, in God's name, no!" Thornton cried, standing between the men and the church doors. "You've lost your mind, man," Cartwright added, his voice sharp with clinical urgency. "We don't know what's down there. It's not a cave. It's a structure. The pressure wave from a blast. It could be catastrophic. It could trigger a collapse. It could release God knows what." "That's the point, Doctor," Thorne sneered, shoving Cartwright so hard he stumbled. "We're venting the gas. We're collapsing the structure. I am restoring order to my town." "It's not your town, Ambrose," Thornton roared, his faith returning as a blaze of pure fury. "It belongs to God, and you will not desecrate it." "God has no jurisdiction in a hole," Thorne said coldly. "Brody, set the charges in the cellar. I want this church and its blasphemous basement turned into a pile of splinters." Brody and 2 miners pushed past the Reverend, using their pickaxe handles to shatter the main church doors. They stormed inside, heading for the barred cellar entrance. "Stop!" Cartwright yelled, running after them. "The air! You don't know what you're breathing!" But as Brody reached the cellar door, he froze. He held his lantern up. A shadow fell over them. They all turned. Silas was standing in the shattered doorway of the church. Behind him stood the other diggers. All 47. They had come from their homes, from the fields, from the streets. They had converged on the church at the same moment. They were silent. They carried no weapons. They simply stood. Their movements were perfectly synchronized as they fanned out, forming a living wall inside the sanctuary, blocking the path to the cellar. Their cold, calm, inhuman patience was more terrifying than any army. Thorne's men, who faced rock falls and gas pockets for a living, backed away. This was something their tools couldn't fight. "What is this?" Thorne demanded, his voice cracking. "Get out of the way! This is my property!" Silas stepped forward. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a low, resonant hum, as if he were speaking around a held note. "You will not make noise. You will not interrupt the Count." The Count?" Thorne stammered. "It's waiting," another digger said, her eyes fixed on the cellar door. "It's listening. We are the guardians, until the way is open." Thomas Wells, the bell ringer, stepped out from the group. He looked at Thorne with a profound, sad detachment. "You're too loud, Mr. Thorne. You're disturbing them." "This is madness!" Thorne shouted, but his voice was thin. He was a man of power, and his power had just evaporated. He looked at Brody. "Light the fuse, man! Now!" Brody held up his hands, shaking. "I can't, boss. Look at him. It ain't right. It ain't human." The standoff held for a long, terrible minute. The 6 armed miners against the 47 empty-handed things. The stalemate was broken by a new sound. It was not the bells. It was not a voice. It was a low, pervasive, subsonic hum. It was the sound of a billion-ton generator spinning up to speed. It came from the cellar, vibrating up through the floor, making the dynamite crates rattle on the stone. As one, the 47 diggers turned away from Thorne. Their duty as guardians was over. The time for waiting had passed. They all looked at the cellar door. Thomas Wells walked to the door, his movements fluid and graceful. He unbarred the heavy wooden plank that Thornton and Cartwright had set. He tossed it aside. It clattered loudly on the stone, the only sound in the church besides the deep, rising hum. Thomas turned and gave Reverend Thornton a look of gentle, absolute peace. "He's waiting for us, Reverend," he said, his voice now part of the hum itself. "Jacob is holding the way open. The first bell was the call. This is the gathering. We're sorry you can't come." He turned and walked down the steps into the darkness of the basement. The other 46 followed. In a single, silent, orderly file, they descended into the cellar. men and women, young and old. They moved not like people, but like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They did not look back. They did not hesitate. They walked down the stairs, across the cellar floor, and disappeared, one by one, into the black polished shaft in the earth. Ambrose Thorne and his men stood frozen, their dynamite forgotten. Dr. Cartwright was frantically taking notes, his hand cramping. They are not being forced. There is no panic. It is a willing migration. A pilgrimage. They are being recalled. The entity. It's summoning its parts. Reverend Thornton fell to his knees, clutching his cross. He was not praying. He was weeping. He was weeping for the damnation of his flock. Ilara Morrison had been drawn by the hum, her body moving against her will, the baby inside her suddenly, painfully active. She arrived at the churchyard just in time to see the last of the 47, old Mrs. Gable, moving with a speed she hadn't possessed in 30 years, disappear into the church. She watched, her hand on her belly, as the low hum from the cellar pulsed once, like a vast heart. And then it fell silent. The church was empty, save for the 3 shocked, rational men and their useless explosives. Cartwright, Thornton, and Thorne were left alone, the 90 remaining uncalled souls of Asherton cowering in their homes. The town was no longer just frightened. It was culled. It was hollowed out. What do we do now?" Cartwright asked, his voice a dry rasp in the sudden deafening silence. Ambrose Thorne, his face the color of ash, dropped his unlit cigar. "The mine," he whispered. "The shaft. It's just like my mine." He turned and ran, stumbling, from the church, screaming for Brody, not to attack, but to evacuate. Reverend Thornton remained on his knees, his gaze lost in the dark opening of the cellar stairs. "We are the shepherds, Doctor," he said, his voice broken, "and the flock has just been sorted. We are the ones who were left behind. We are the chaff." From the open cellar, from the black, polished shaft that now held 50 of his parishioners, a single cold gust of wind rose, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old blood and ozone, and, just barely, the echo of a single distant, welcoming bell. The gateway was open, and it was waiting. Ambrose Thorne did not stop running until he reached the black, gaping maw of his own colliery, mine shaft number 3, the deepest and richest seam. Brody and his terrified, dynamite-laden men were right behind him. He wasn't running from the church's cellar. He was running to it, or rather, to its sibling. "The bedrock!" he gasped, leaning against a coal cart, his face a mask of sweat and terror. "Brody, the drills, the new steam drill last May. You remember? What did it hit at 900 feet? Brody's face, already pale, turned the color of limestone. "The bedrock, sir. The purple stone. The stuff that rang. The drill bit shattered. Shattered 3 of them. We thought it was just anomalous basalt." "It's the same," Thorne whispered, his mind, built on logic and numbers, finally making the last, horrifying calculation. "It's the same. It's not under the church. It's under everything. It's the floor, Brody. The floor of the whole valley." He grabbed the man's shirt. "Evacuate the mine. Now. Not just this shaft. All of them. Get the men. Get them all out. The hole in the church. It wasn't a well. It was a drain. And they just pulled the plug." As if summoned by his words, the ground beneath their feet groaned. It was not the sharp crack of a mineshaft collapse. It was a deep, torsional, tectonic sound. The sound of a billion-ton object shifting its weight. From the black mouth of mineshaft 3, a cloud of methane and coal dust blasted outward, followed by a sound that would haunt Thorne's dreams for the rest of his short life. The high-pitched metallic scream of support beams, iron tracks, and steam donkeys being drawn, not blown, downward. Pulled, as if by an incomprehensible gravity, into the earth. The ground of the valley sank. Not by inches, but by feet. A slow, sickening, concave settling, as if the entire basin of Asherton were a great stone bowl settling onto its base. Houses tilted, trees leaned. The creek running through the valley floor reversed its flow for a whole minute, its water churning with black, oily sediment that smelled of sulfur. At the church, the effect was immediate. The great stone tower, the 120-foot lie, tore away from the main building with a shriek of ripping timber. It did not topple. It sank, straight down, disappearing into the ravaged earth as if it were a stake being driven into the ground, swallowed whole, until nothing remained but a jagged, churning pit of splintered wood and stone. The cellar shaft, its purpose fulfilled, collapsed in on itself, taking the church's entire foundation with it. The pews, the altar, Reverend Thornton's pulpit, all of it slid into a newly formed chasm, swallowed by the darkness. Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thornton were thrown from their feet. They, along with Alara Morrison, who had been frozen in the churchyard, were the last witnesses. They clung to the heaving grass, watching the house of God be consumed, erased, as if it had never been. And then, as suddenly as it began, the movement stopped. The valley was still, but it was different. It was lower. The very air felt heavier, pressed down, the sky seeming farther away. The new silence was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of a predator after a meal. The official story was born from the wreckage. By the time the investigators arrived from Philadelphia 2 days later, summoned by Ambrose Thorne's frantic censored telegraph, the narrative was already set. They found a town in ruins, but not from an earthquake. The ground had simply settled. They found a collapsed mine shaft and a destroyed church. They found Ambrose Thorne, now composed, his suit brushed, his brandy in hand, ready with his explanation. A geological catastrophe, Thorne explained to the lead state investigator, a pragmatic, humorless man named Harris. A sinkhole of unprecedented size, centered on the church and my deepest shaft. It released a massive pocket of anaerobic gas. And the missing? Harris asked, taking notes in a small book. The gas, Dr. Cartwright supplied, his voice a dull monotone. He had agreed to the story. What was the alternative? The truth? It was hallucinogenic, toxic. It induced a state of mass hysteria in the more susceptible members of the congregation. The diggers, we called them. Hysteria? Harris looked skeptical. 50 people? They were suggestible, Cartwright said, choosing his words with dead, clinical precision. They believed the sound from the settling earth was a sign. They dug. They exposed themselves to the highest concentrations. In their madness, they fled. They ran into the mountains. We haven't been able to find them. Reverend Thornton, sitting in the corner of Thorne's office, wrapped in a blanket, just laughed. A dry, rattling sound. Find them? Oh no, you won't find them. They weren't fleeing, Mr. Harris. They were arriving. They were expected. It was a promise, you see. The ground remembers. Harris looked at the Reverend with pity. Get this man a sedative, doctor. He's clearly broken. The investigator turned back to Thorne. So, 50 people, including the miner Morrison, are lost in the wilderness? A tragedy, Thorne said, his face a perfect mask of civic grief. We are organizing search parties, but the mountains are vast. We fear the worst. The case was closed within a week. The official report cited anomalous geological subsidence and mass hysteria due to inhalation of subterranean gases. The 50 missing souls of Asherton were declared legally dead, presumed perished from exposure. Ambrose Thorne's insurance claims were vast and, remarkably, paid in full. The sealing was done not by the town, but by the state. Citing public safety, they brought in work crews. The chasm where the church had stood was deemed geologically unstable. It was filled with thousands of tons of rock and slag from Thorne's other, safe mines. Finally, it was capped with a 6-foot-thick slab of concrete. A permanent, government-funded seal. Asherton was dead. The 90 survivors did not rebuild. They were the uncalled, the ones the Bells had rejected, and they knew it. They lived in a town that had been hollowed out, its very foundation now revealed as a thin, fragile shell over something else. They sold their land for pennies on the dollar to Thorne's holding company and drifted away, taking their silence and their nightmares with them, scattering into the wider, unsuspecting world. Ambrose Thorne did not stay to enjoy his victory. He liquidated his assets, closed the remaining mines, and moved to Philadelphia, a wealthy man. He died 6 years later, not from an accident, but from an aggressive, unidentifiable cancer of the bone. His doctors baffled by the way his marrow seemed to have crystallized. Dr. Cartwright also returned to Philadelphia. He never practiced medicine again. He spent the last 40 years of his life in a small, rented room, compiling his notes from that week into a vast, incoherent manuscript. He filled thousands of pages with calculations, sketches of the bell song's harmonics, and desperate philosophical theories about inhuman architecture and sonic-based organisms. The manuscript, titled The Asherton Resonancy, was dismissed by his peers as the work of a brilliant mind shattered by trauma, and it now gathers dust in the archives of the Miskatonic University. Reverend Isaiah Thornton was the only one who stayed. He was found, 3 months after the sealing, living in the ruins of the parsonage. He was taken to the state asylum, where he spent the rest of his life. He was not violent. He was not mad. He was, as the orderlies noted, waiting. He sat in his small room, his ear pressed to the cold stone floor, tapping. Tap, 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 tap. When a nurse asked him what he was doing, he smiled, his eyes clear and bright. I'm holding the pattern, child. Keeping time. The count continues. The bells ring in depths we cannot hear. And when it reaches 0, the way will open again. And this time, they will not forget us. This time, they will take us all. Alara Morrison was the first to leave. She fled the valley before the investigators even arrived, a small carpet bag in one hand, the other pressed to her belly. She took a train east, as far as her meager savings would carry her. She ended up in a tenement in New York City, a place so loud, so full of steel and steam and human noise, that she prayed it would drown out the memory of the bells. She gave birth 2 months later, in the dead of winter, alone in her cold room. It was a hard, silent birth. The child, a boy, did not cry. He simply arrived, pale and perfect, with wide, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. She named him Jacob. She raised him in the anonymity of the teeming city. He was a quiet child, eerily quiet. He never laughed, never cried. He just watched. He learned to speak but preferred silence. His teachers at the public school found him unsettling. He was brilliant, a prodigy with mathematics, but he had no friends. He preferred to sit at the window, watching the crowds, his fingers tapping silent, complex rhythms on the glass. The story ends here, or perhaps it begins. It is 1891. Jacob is 12 years old. He is tall for his age, pale and slender, with his father's deep, knowing eyes. Alara has found work as a seamstress, and they live in a 6th-floor apartment overlooking the endless, frantic construction of the growing metropolis. She comes home one evening, exhausted, to find the apartment dark. The fire is out. The air is cold. "Jacob!" she calls out, a familiar old dread tightening her chest. "Jacob, are you there?" He is sitting at the window, a dark silhouette against the gaslit city. He is perfectly still. "You should light the fire, Jacob. You'll catch your death." "I don't feel the cold, Mother." His voice is flat, a low monotone, just like Silas's had been. "What are you watching?" she asks, her hands trembling as she lights a lamp. "The work," he says. "They are digging, for the new subway tunnels. They're digging very deep, you know. Deeper than any cellar." Alara stops, the match burning her fingers. She looks at her son. He is not looking at the street. He is looking down, as if he can see through the pavement, through the bedrock of the island itself. "Jacob," she whispers, the word catching in her throat. He turns. His face is calm, serene, and terribly beautiful in the lamplight. His eyes are not the eyes of a child. They are the eyes of something ancient and patient. "It's almost time, Mother," he says, his voice a soft, resonant hum that she feels in her bones. The first count is almost complete. The valley was just a rehearsal. They're singing so loudly tonight. "Can't you hear them?" He turns back to the window, placing his small, pale hand on the cold glass. "They're singing," he whispers, a faint, terrifying smile touching his lips. "They're singing for me, the ones below the pavement." His finger begins to tap against the glass, a familiar, complex, syncopated rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. It is the song of the deep bells. And in the canyons of the new modern world, in the deep places being excavated by steam and steel, the count continues. The deep places remember, and they are waiting. The end.